So there you are. It's the early 80s. Some people say they're maybe gone. I would have been, they're definitely gone. If someone thinks they're maybe gone, I'd say they're gone. Oh, you know what? Here's another one everybody's still looking for.
What?
The ivory-billed woodpecker.
Yeah. Well, I saw one when I was back when I was a bird watcher, by the way. That's out of
What year?
It would be early 70s.
Oh.
Yeah, I thought I saw one anyway. But I'm sure it was a pileated woodpecker.
But no one's laid eyes on one since, I don't know. But every year people go looking for them.
Yeah.
And they see what we call, where I'm from, pileated woodpeckers.
Yeah, pileated woodpeckers. And it's the same phenomena, I think. The Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. Here's another thing. To have a viable population of any species, you need 50 or more individuals to live for 100 years.
Okay, but who gets to make that? Who gets to say that that's the truth?
That came out, Michael Tewes, 1980. It was like the beginning of MVPs, minimum viable populations, of discussions, and it has since became much more complicated since then. But that was
he's like, hear ye, hear ye.
Yeah.
If you have 50 of something.
Well, and that's computer modeling will show that for a lot of species, and now it's called population viability analyses.
Okay.
We've done 2 different PhD projects on that. You put in all these life parameters, and you can estimate how long a population of a certain size will persist over time.
I guess I'm incredulous of it because I could see if you said for large mammals, for instance, it would take a population of X, right?
Right.
For large marine mammals, it would require, but if we're talking about a plant, do you know what I'm saying? It's
Generation time is an important part of a mouse versus an elephant. Yeah. And it's part of this modeling. There are a lot of variables that go into this modeling. But there's been much research done on that. But the gist of it is if you have a very small population, it's very unlikely to survive a long period of time. So I kind of call that a viable population of a Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster. You probably need at least 50 of them. If you're going to have 50 Loch Ness Monsters, you probably need several lochs to have a population.
I went to that loch one time and looked out upon it. Didn't see anything. Man, I wish you were more. I wish you liked to talk about Bigfoot because I could. Here's the thing: in talking to you, I could get better at arguing with Bigfoot people.
Yeah, no,
I'll just call you sometime.
I sent those letters.
You could give me a crash course on what one might say in an argument with Bigfoot people to make you seem more right.
I'll forward you to those threatening letters that I got.
We will often say that if a female of whatever species, let's say we're talking about ocelots, like if she can successfully produce 2, if she can have 2 offspring that make it to breeding age, she was successful. And you would hold the population. Like the population would remain static. Is that like an acceptable thing to say to somebody?
Well, what is it? The humans? You have to have at least 2.3 humans to maintain.
Is that what okay.
I learned that 20 years ago. Maybe
obsolete
by now. But
I think about that with salmon and stuff, right? Is they're dropping, I don't know, thousands of eggs. And it'd be like, if 2 of those eggs makes it, the fish was successful.
Yeah.
2 of the eggs with sturgeon, they're producing in a lifetime millions of eggs. If 2 of those make it, that's a successful fish.
Yeah. And their strategies just produce eggs, and there's no parental care. And then you have the reverse, where elephants may put in years for making sure their young survive to breeding age. So and you have everything in between. But 2.3 humans, I guess, to replace, and that seems logical, I guess.
Can you real quick explain those strategies where they have letters applied to them, right? Like the rabbit strategy or whatever.
Oh, K selected species and R selected species.
Yeah,
is that what
that's right. Meaning like you have a ton of them and don't pay any attention to them.
Yeah, that's R selected species and help me, Neal, if I'm wrong. K selected species is where they invest a lot of energy and time in raising the young and making sure they reach breeding age.
Yeah, like a black bear, right? She's gonna spend 2 years tutoring her offspring, caring for and tutoring her offspring.
Yeah.
And a rabbit's like, see ya.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to live. you get out of here. Yeah, no, I know a lot of prey are like that. The rodents and everything else.
What was it that you actually wanted the ocelot for when you went out to catch one? When you said, I'm going to study ocelots, people were like, there's probably not need to study or whatever. But like, what really were you wanting one for?
We had everything you could list at the time. We wanted to learn about its home range size, how many there were, what kind of social organization do they have, what are their activities, just the basic natural history.
Like enough to fill out an Audubon guidebook.
Yeah, and we probably did. We probably did at the time. That was the very first ocelot study, and then another one started in Venezuela a few months later, but nothing was known at that time about ocelots.
It was the first ocelot study?
Yeah.
When you learned from when you had to go ask around about how to go get one, lay out like what kind of sets you were making and how you were catching them. Because it's kind of weird. It's like a thing I haven't seen, a strategy that I don't know why it's not more widely used.
Well, we've
like
used
using
box
live
traps.
birds.
Yeah, we use and they stay alive, by the way. Just want to make that point. We use box traps.
Yeah, I mean, okay, sure.
Tomahawk box traps.
But imagine the night imagine the night that pigeon spends separated by some 1/4-inch mesh from an ocelot.
We started off with chickens for the first 20 or 30 years, and it's amazing. It's not what you would think. I would walk up in the morning to check traps, and the ocelot would be sound asleep, and the chicken was trying to pick fleas off the ears of the ocelot.
Are you
More
serious?
than multiple times. That happened several times. They attained a relationship during the night.
So it doesn't like destroy the chicken's psyche.
It's hard to tell a chicken psyche, but I didn't detect that.
No, yeah, I'm not condemning. I mean, it's like plus you have every justification when you're trying to like find out what's going on with something that's going to be like wiped off the face of the earth. If it gives a chicken a little bit of a heartburn for a night.
Well, Ted was my favorite rooster, and he lost one eye in a battle with a raccoon and things. But this was in 1982, 83. But he persisted, and he caught several ocelots, big white rooster. I would place the roosters a certain distance apart, so in the early morning they'd be crowing to each other.
Oh,
and then it's like a natural predator call. Those I'm sure it helped ocelots.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. Thank you.
So describe the trap now, and like kind of like where you go to set it and how you figured out where to go set
hold on,
it.
can we? I want to know why we don't use chickens anymore. It's pigeons now.
Well, they crap too much and eat too much food. It's a basic reason. And pigeons.
It's cheaper.
Or they do less of both. Less defecation problem, less food, and they're very happy. And the birds, we take very good. I mean, you wouldn't believe the care we take care of the pigeons in the aviary. They're treated very well, and but it's very effective. And so I use white pigeons to try to increase the light during the night, and we'll catch as many bobcats and ocelots. Typically 100 trap nights, 150 trap nights to catch one ocelot or one bobcat. That's 10 traps out for 15 nights to get 150 trap nights. Or one trap per one night is one trap night.
Yeah, I'm tracking.
So they're pretty easy. But jaguarundis in Mexico is over 1,000 trap nights to catch one jaguarundi. They're very, very difficult to catch, and that's why no one's published on them, I guess, so far.
All right, explain the set, like the set for an ocelot. And I want to get back into the bait thing, too.
Okay. Well, first you find out where there's a local roadkill, if you can. So there's probably a population nearby. Then you look for the densest brush near that roadkill. And
just one roadkill.
Pretty much. Yeah, they're not all, but it probably 80% of them will reflect where a population is. Yeah, it's really pretty effective.
Hold on, but you can't be telling me that every time you drive down the southern Texas highway and you see a roadkill that there's a population of ocelots nearby.
Well, there have been very few locations of roadkills. They've only been near the two populations.
Oh, roadkill of an ocelot.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah,
no, I was.
Oh, I got you. You thought he meant any old roadkill.
Yeah, I'm thinking, there's a dead Neal guy. Let's set up an ocelot trap.
No,
so you find the recent ocelot
yes.
roadkill dead and then go from there.
Yeah.
But there were, but in 82, there weren't any dead ocelots on the road.
There weren't, and I understand now. The refuge only had 7 to 14, and no one had reported a recent ocelot roadkill there. The other larger population, 80% of the ocelots occur on 5 to 7 ranches, large ranches, and you were probably on one of them, the Hacienda Iteria Ranch, just recently. We believe there's probably some nearby there. But these are large ranches away from the 2 roads that are there. There are only 2 highways, and so the big population's away from roads. That explains part of it.
So when you went out to catch one, you just went to the last place, like how, you know what I mean? How did you decide, like, well, here's a place to try?
Well, I had
it was the last place known to have seen one or something?
A couple of old trappers told me where they trapped them in the past.
Oh, okay.
And sure enough, it's really the same place they've been trapping them since 1940s and 50s. And they're still there in those few places.
Okay, and talk about the set now.
Box trap. So we find the densest brush and the largest patch of that densest brush that we can. Thorn shrub is their habitat. There'll be 35 different species of thorny shrub species there. It's an amazingly beautifully complex shrub community. Any place we can find a trail in that we can get to easily, or where a trail intersects another trail, it increases your odds. So we'd look for that, and so a history of cats, good habitat, and then looking for trail sites, a place to trap, and then pretty good chance you'll catch a cat if there's one there in a short period of time.
You know what we didn't talk about that I meant to ask you about? What were the hell people doing with them when they were trapping? In the 40s, 50s, 60s, when they were getting knocked.
Yeah.
Were they selling them as in the fur markets?
Yeah, they were. There's a record I just sent Neal from the 1940s of these 2 ocelots that were trapped in Starr County, which is right adjacent to Rio Grande, and he sold them for $2.50 per pelt. So they would sell them in the old days, and like a lot of the pelts, they sell them.
So you could go down and get like yourself like an ocelot jacket or something back then.
Yeah. If you go back for enough in time, there was a very popular trading thing on the frontier. People didn't have cash; they couldn't spend money. So if you wanted to get some milk or some eggs, you trade something, and often an ocelot pelt was very valuable in trading. And the Comanches would use them for saddles. They would just throw an ocelot pelt on the horse and then ride on that. It's kind of a
riding style.
There,
man.
Right.
Yeah.
And the quivers for the arrows would be ocelot quivers. Ocelot pelts would be. It was really interesting how it was important in the frontier.
Just because they were so cool looking, probably.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when you caught the first one, what'd you catch down? A chicken or a pigeon?
The very first one of all the cats we've caught, 250, we technically caught it on a padded leg hold trap, a 2.5
Oh, you
padded.
did? That was pre-live trap.
Yes.
Before you were using live traps.
Yeah, and we in our federal permit, we had in there the fact that we could use leg hold traps, box traps, or even hounds.
Okay.
And let me see, John, my buddy who's out of Maine, helped me catch that first ocelot on the Guadalupe Ranch, and he was working on. So he had the padded leg holds, and so that all the other cats since that very first cat had been with box traps. So 5 days later, I caught another ocelot with a box trap. So yeah, it's and the chicken thing has worked around the world. Again, we've trapped 12 different species of cats all on chickens. So it's kind of amazing how.
Like you got a box trap, and in the back of where you put the bait, there's a separate little cage.
Exactly.
And the bird hangs out in there.
And they're protected, and they're food and water, all they want to eat. But cats like chickens.
And he comes in there and triggers a thing and kicks the treadle or whatever, and the door shuts.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. We used to put lures sometimes, or we'd hang some flagging. You hang a feather so it blows in the wind, or some fur. We found we don't even need to use lure if you just have the bird there. That works as good as anything.
No, find that thing.
Yeah.
No lure.
Well,
I like that crowing trick, putting them out so they crow back and forth.
Yeah, it made me feel good. It made me think that I actually had it figured out and stuff. But I don't know. I think it helped a little.
When you came into it, I would have thought that at that point they get ESA protection in what, 82?
82 for the U.S., yeah.
Why did that not lead to... Why was that insufficient? To like, why were the numbers still going down? Like in 85, they're still going down.
Well, the numbers were probably very similar, but the genetic erosion of the same population, we were monitoring decline of heterozygosity, or the genetic variation. So that's why it was going down. The numbers were probably about the same. I think for the last, since we started 38 years ago, the numbers have always been about the same, but they increase in wet years and you have high prey. But when the droughts hit, you get a 2-3 year drought. It affects the ocelot survival. We've documented that through our research, that you get a severe drought 6 months into it, the vegetation is really pretty much gone. The rodents and rabbits that decline from that vegetation. And then you see failure of ocelot reproduction about 12, 18 months later. And that can only go for so long when you have so few cats. And the ocelots disperse. A lot of the subordinate or subdominant individuals will disperse, and we found that the home ranges of the residents will expand. So, and the residents will survive because they've got it figured out. They know what the home range is. They know where to hide, where to find food. Every night they really intensively explore their home range, and they have an understanding of real-time understanding of where the prey is, where the dangers are, where the coyotes' risks are and things. And so they know when the prey starts to decline, the residents probably push off the dispersers, and the dispersers are the ones that die. They have much lower survival.
They die from...
Road kills.
Yeah, hit by cars.
Yep, that's the number one form of mortality now is road kills.
What else? You were mentioning coyotes. Coyotes will kill them?
We've never documented that. I'm sure it would happen for kittens at least. But the fact that they use really dense brush, most of the time coyotes won't go into that brush. But if a pack of coyotes found one in the open, it probably would be a problem. But there's enough other things that will kill them. We've had them die from rattlesnake bites, ingesting a grass burr into the lungs.
Oh, yeah?
Mange.
Do you lose them, too, just from people being like, what the hell is that? And then shoot it? Which seems to be a real thing.
Well, it happened only once that I can think of in the late 1990s. So.
You did it, Neal?
No, not me. Oh. I wasn't identifying myself. I was just saying it happened once.
That was not me. That was a one time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well,
that's how he got interested in the subject.
The story I heard was that it was a hunter out of Houston shot one with a bow and arrow. Yeah.
Because he
thought it was a bobcat.
Oh, okay.
And about 1 out of 10 bobcats have spots just like an ocelot. So it's really hard to distinguish.
Well, but you got the whole tail problem.
Yeah, and a bobcat has sometimes surprisingly long tail, 6 inches. Mm-hmm. So someone who's not out there hunting all the time can fall into that.
Yeah,
that happens all the time, even with people that know what they're looking at. I was a young biologist. It was about 1984, 1985, and I was working on a piece of ground and called Mike Tewes out in 1985 and told him that a buddy of mine and myself had seen an ocelot, and it was close by in Jim Wells County, and sure enough, an ocelot population hadn't been found there since. So
it's bobcat.
It was bobcat.
Yeah,
we didn't know what we were talking about.
If since the first time someone ever studied them, they found like, okay, it looks basically like this, and then that remains static for 30, 40 years. How do you demonstrate that there's a problem? Because there's no real baseline idea, right? Like if you were going in 82 to do like baseline data gathering, and not like what are things supposed to look like, but what do they look like? And it looked like that, and it still looks like that. How do you convince people that we're facing a problem?
Well, I think that just the fact when what we call the refuge population only has 7 to 14 individuals. If you're lucky, you have half of that as females, 7. And there's this thing called demographic stochasticity. Sooner or later, you're going to have 14 males and no females. Just by chance, over time. That's what happened with the seaside dusky sparrow. Came down to 6 individuals. They all turned out to be males, and that was the extinction
Oh,
of the
you
species.
kidding me?
There's some real practical reasons why we should think that they were more widely spread. Right now, if you were to look on the coast and the center of the population for ocelots, we had Hurricane Hannah come through.
Okay.
What was it, maybe 5-6 weeks ago, maybe a little bit longer. Hurricane Hannah, it was a Category 1 hurricane. The eye of that hurricane came right over top dead center, the center of the universe for ocelots in Texas. If, in fact, that would have been, say, a Category 4 hurricane like Hurricane Laura that hit the southwest coast of Louisiana, we probably would have lost that population of ocelots. So if you've got,
Yeah, I got what you're saying.
you've got them geographically confined in an area right there, and they all exist, 80% of them got to be below 20 foot in elevation. And you get a storm surge, you get you get everything that comes along with a major hurricane. There's no way that they will last and will last for very much longer, just with that one particular source of, potential catastrophe to them.
Yeah, no, I got you. That's an interesting point. And also that idea that if you have like carrying capacity for such a small number, I never thought about the fact that you could wind up in a situation where they're all the same gender.
Yeah, that's the demographic stochasticity. You got the environmental stochasticity. You get a 5-year or 10-year drought, that might do it.
And
Every 100 years, we get a 5 or 10-year drought.
And we've got habitat elsewhere, not right next to it, but habitat elsewhere that's perfectly good ocelot habitat, not occupied.
What is not worked? Why has the ESA protection not been? I guess if you look at ESA protection as being keep it from going extinct, we're here to keep it from going extinct. That's not what it is. But if you look at that being success, you could argue like, okay, it was successful because they're not extinct. But if you look at ESA protection as being a vehicle that would lead to recovery, and it's not a one-way road, and the expectation would be, I think it only happens 2% of the time. I'm not saying that's the fault of the ESA, but has a very low success rate in terms of something going on the ESA list and getting off is 2% of things. I think a variety of things happens. It goes on, and then they realize that it shouldn't have gone on because they find other populations. It goes on, and it's already gone. Or it goes on and becomes gone.
Yeah.
So not many things make it off. But what is preventing since 1982 to now? What has made it that now we're not like the same way we are about bald eagles, where you almost get sick of looking at bald eagles?
Yeah. Well, in Texas, it's 97% private land. Probably unlike any other state, Texas retained its private lands. So any management, conservation of wildlife is dependent on private landowners. And Neal can probably address this as good as anyone. The disincentives that are built into the Endangered Species Act and the fear that many landowners have that they'll lose their ability to manage the lands they wanted in the way that they want to gives them no incentive to even identify that they have an endangered species on their property. In their view, for many of them, it's a disincentive. Neal, you think?
Yeah, so if you look at ocelots, for example, 100 ocelots, probably greater than 70% of those ocelots are on private lands in Texas. And these are large ranches. There's against the tide desire by those private landowners to somehow conserve ocelots for reasons of their own. Some of those are stewardship reasons, that it would be a shame, given that treasure that exists on those lands, to let that species go extinct. Now, if you look over at the Endangered Species Act, and let's say it's a ream of paper, they just print the whole act out and everything that has to do with it, about a ream of paper. About 2 sheets of those papers say something about private lands, and basically it says, thou shalt not kill an endangered species intentionally. Absolute, except for some cases, and some nuanced exceptions with wolves and other things. And thou shalt not take an endangered species incidental to any other land use practice. That's it.
Hold on, say that last part again.
Thou shalt not take an endangered species as it being incidental to an otherwise legal land use practice. So,
give me an example of that.
An example of that, and the example of an ocelot is if you've got a fence line that runs through ocelot habitat, and you were to disturb the habitat by clearing out that fence line, that might be considered by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to be an action that alters the behavior or the breeding probabilities of ocelots, and therefore it's a prohibited act under the act.
I follow you. I thought it meant that it would lead to like the direct death of, not that it could lead to.
That's what it originally was meant for in the act itself.
But it's interpreted now as deteriorating
Sure.
habitat type or whatever.
Or affecting the behavior. Take and just affecting the behavior.
Sure, yeah, and of course that we came up with that in 1972, right? And so we're driving a 1972 Ford Galaxy 500 policy, trying to work with 2020 conditions, trying to work with things like groups of landowners that are trying to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to figure out how to recover an endangered species. And the Fish and Wildlife Service, sometimes through no fault of their own, can't figure out how to get out of the way and to let it happen.
Okay.
And, it's been called at least once vigilante conservation. When that was first laid out there that way, I thought, well, that's kind of a pejorative term. But then when you really think about it, vigilante is a group of citizens that have taken up a cause because the officials that are supposed to be doing it have abandoned the cause. And so,
what would be an example of vigilante conservationism?
Vigilante conservation would be a group of landowners. For example, in this particular situation, we have landowners that know they have ocelots that would like to do 3 or 4 things. One is to survey for those ocelots to know where they are, and how many of them there are. Well, if you do that, then there's some confidentiality standards that those landowners would like. They'd like for that information not to be leaked to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, simply because the Fish and Wildlife Service would then have to make that available to a lot of these organizations that would file lawsuits and force the Fish and Wildlife Service to do the 2 things that landowners don't like to hear, and that's enforce and have the authority over. And
so if they don't, if you want, like a rancher wants to know, or a landowner wants to know, do I have them? I think they're like, I think they're totally cool. I wish I had more.
Yeah.
I'd like to know if I have one, but I don't want the feds to know. Who are they trusting to sort of like keep track?
That's the problem. And part of the problem is you're inclined to not allow people like Mike Tewes to put his graduate students and researchers on the ground to survey for ocelots.
Because it's going to lead to trouble.
Yeah. We think there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 ocelots in Texas. There could be more. It's an unknown. So that's an extrapolation, right? We don't know how many there are. We don't know exactly where they are. We've got some known populations. One known population is on the East Foundation's El Sal's Ranch. So we've got the largest population known. And we're not afraid of the Endangered Species Act or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, perhaps foolishly, but nevertheless, we're not afraid. We're going to continue to work the research, management, recovery system, and we feel like it's a stewardship responsibility, as do other ranchers, to recover that species. There's, for whatever reason, and it can be a religious reason, it can be a reason that, look, we don't want this to go out on my watch, whatever that is, but you got to take into account in that, at least in that part of the state, in the state that has 142 million acres of private lands, those private landowners are by and large the best conservationists there are. I mean, they care about that land. They've got a stake in it, and they've got a stake in the future reputation for themselves as ranchers and caretakers of that ground. That's the scenario we're finding with ocelots, is we just simply are trying to figure out how to get rid of the disincentives. And be able to assure private landowners in and around that ocelot population that they can allow monitoring, research, and then proactive measures for, say, translocation. We're doing things like collecting semen from male ocelots so that we can perhaps impregnate zoo ocelots and have offspring that we might be able to either from a wild population or from that crossbred zoo population create another translocated population elsewhere so that we don't have to worry about that next hurricane that comes through turning into a Category 4.
Yeah.
I mean, the clock is ticking on that type of catastrophe when you get a population confined to that small of a geographic area and they're that small. And
If you had to characterize the sort of anti-Fed sentiment around, let's say someone they know, their family knows they have ocelots on their property. They don't want to be rolled up into any kind of activities with the scientific community at a federal level for fear that someone's going to come in and go like, oh my gosh, you do have ocelots. I'm shutting this place down because you're not going to be allowed to do X, Y, and Z. Maybe you're not going to be able to do the very things that made it that it was good ocelot habitat anyways, like sort of having economic viability on your property, which makes it that you don't need to develop it, for instance.
Exactly.
But do you find that like the average sentiment that's like the anti-Fed sentiment is educated and precise, meaning they're like, oh, I would love to tell them, but if I tell them, then this could happen to me and it would look like this? Or is it just generally, I hate the feds?
I think it's across the board, obviously, because, in our state, we've got 350,000 decision makers, 350,000 landowners. So it's going to be across the board there. So, and there's experiences that they've seen with other species. So you take something like the golden cheek warbler that may have been used in some cases to halt development in and around the Austin area. You take something like the Dunes sagebrush lizard that in some cases was used to halt oil and gas development in the Permian Basin.
Like was used opportunistically.
Sure.
Yeah. Was used out, like someone wanted a thing to happen and that was the way to make it, or something wanted something to not happen and that bird or that lizard was a way to make it not happen that gave you legal grounds to get your way.
Now, we've got the flip side of the coin with the ocelot, real interestingly. There's organizations that use it as a mascot for fundraising that then don't do much for the ocelot. We've got, I think this is a good thing. Our Texas Department of Transportation, you can get an ocelot license plate.
Okay.
There's more ocelot license plates in Texas than there are ocelots in Texas. And you can see more driving between San Antonio and Austin. You can see more ocelot license plates than there are ocelots in deep South Texas. So people love them.
Yep.
You'll see ranchers with ocelot license plates, so you know ranchers love them. They want to figure out how to recover ocelots without putting large ownerships that depend on economic viability at stake, and so they need assurances. And so, I think it boils down to just raw trust in economics. And it's not just and it's not that there's bad people at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There's good people. They're caught managing an act that in some cases is antiquated, and there's sophisticated organizations that have figured out how to sue them, and they know. And every conversation you'll have with the Fish and Wildlife Service over anything, it'll all come down to okay, what happens when Group X, Group Y, or Group Z sues us because we've worked out a deal with you as a private landowner. So okay, here's how we're gonna make sure that we're fully solid on our conservation measures. We're legal on maintaining confidentiality. All of these hoops that you've got to jump through, and for some landowners, they just look. I'm suspicious when I have to apply for permits when you're telling me you have enforcement authority over me and those types of things.
ESA reform, like Endangered Species Act reform, is one of those things that I'm like, you hear it all the time, and I'm leery about it because I support it, but I probably don't support it in the way that other people support it. It's one of those things that's become to mean, it's having to the word conservation. Like, I could say, I'm pro-conservation. You know, like different politicians say I'm pro-conservation. You're like, what exactly do you mean? And you realize that they're talking about something that you're not talking about.
What?
And a lot of people that talk about Endangered Species Act reform, a significant amount are saying, what I mean by that is I would like the damn thing to go away. And a significant amount are saying, I mean that it could be more effective if we change it and make it more flexible to account for like what you're talking about in the situation of the ocelot. So for me to now say, if someone asks, like, do you support Endangered Species Act reform, I'd have to say, I'll have to ask you a series of questions before I answer because I don't know what you're getting at.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I say that, and I don't say reform often, I just say changes to the Endangered Species Act or how it's administered, and I don't care which. I'm looking for better performance on private lands.
Mm-hmm.
And why that? What's the big deal there? You look at more than 1/3 of endangered species that are currently listed entirely depend on private lands, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 75% have a large portion of their range across private lands. So if we've got an Endangered Species Act that's not performing as well as it could perform on private lands, then maybe it needs some reform. But I get it about being worried about cracking the act open.
Yeah.
You know, if we're driving that 1972 Galaxy 500, you know, we crack it open and we want to reupholster the seats and put a new, more efficient engine in it so it's not getting 3 miles to the gallon. Somebody else might want to put a whole bunch of other stuff in there.
Yeah.
That, you know, and oftentimes you'll hear people just lay out, the one-liner, well, the act needs more teeth. Well, that's one of those things that means a different thing to different people. You know, oftentimes when someone says that, they basically mean we want the Fish and Wildlife Service to be more like policemen and enforcement officers rather than doing whatever it takes by any means possible to result in the recovery of endangered species across all lands, whether it's public lands or private lands.
I think it would be phenomenal if we could find ways to better work with private landowners on ESA issues in a way that still allowed the ultimate goal to move forward. But I do think that the way we do it now and the way that we handle private interests leads to a thing where it's kind of like the spotted owl syndrome, where a spotted owl, after the whole debacle with logging and the spotted owl, a spotted owl didn't mean a bird anymore. Right. Like when you hear the word spotted owl, you don't think like, oh, it's a little owl that lives in old growth forest. You think like spotted owl is federal overreach, right? Because there are things that we do that really, there are things that we do in the service of prolonging or saving species that makes them have like this entirely negative connotation in people's heads who have to suffer with it most. And I think in around here in this neck of the woods, the most egregious examples are what's been done to people around ESA listing for wolves and ESA listings for grizzlies, which they've been recovered by definition for decades, yet you continue to make it hard on private landowners to go about their business because we like move the goalposts. Move the goalposts all along, and then that creates this sort of like this anti-wolf sentiment, this anti-grizzly sentiment that I don't think it's necessary to create the anti-wolf, anti-grizzly sentiment. Like I don't think that you have to make that in order to save those things. There has to be a way to reduce the friction and still hit the ultimate outcome, and it would probably come around from some form of reform.
Sure. And I know what you're talking about. I was a wildlife biologist for a timber company in the Pacific Northwest in the early 1990s. And so I was hated from both sides, right? Because I was inside the timber company, so I was hated by our loggers.
But then you were a biologist.
Yeah, I was a biologist, so I was hated by the others. But learn to work, put habitat conservation plans together so that we could live with the spotted owl. There were huge financial reasons to do that, and so there in the Pacific Northwest around spotted owls, marble murrelets, Pacific salmon, there's huge financial interests at being able to put together some type of collaborative deal, a habitat conservation plan that worked for private lands and worked for endangered species. We don't necessarily have that with all species in all places. You know, when you've got a small salamander that shuts down what you think is a housing development that ought to go forward, you're likely to just shake your fist if you're the housing developer at that salamander, figure out how you can hide the fact that it's there. You know, we don't want it on our property. It in and of itself becomes the enemy, right? We've got to figure out how to remove the disincentives, and this is the canned comment, right? Remove the disincentives and create incentives. And that's easy to say. It's hard to do. It's a really hard thing to do, to create those out-of-the-box incentives that always work with private landowners. But it is doable.